My name is Robin Bronen. I work as the Executive Director of the Alaska Institute for Justice, where we are currently working with 15 Alaska Native communities, two of whom have made the decision that the relocation of their entire community is the best long-term adaptation strategy to the climate crisis currently occurring. Climate-induced community relocations are the greatest human rights challenge of our time. Those who have least contributed to our climate crisis are now the first to face the permanent loss of their homelands and thus need to relocate. Population relocation affects the human right to life and self-determination, as well as a wide range of social, economic, and cultural rights. Alaska Native communities are among the first communities to decide that relocation of their entire community is the only long-term adaptation strategy to protect the lives of community residents from climate change. I am going to begin this lecture by talking about the climate crisis currently occurring in Alaska, the only Arctic state in the United States. Temperature increases are occurring twice as fast in the Arctic than in the lower latitudes. This is called polar amplification. In 2016, Alaska had its warmest year on record. At the local level, the annual average temperature, for instance, in Utqiagvik, formerly known as Barrow, was 7.1 degrees Fahrenheit above the 1981 to 2010 average. At the top of the slide, you can see two pictures of the temperature anomalies occurring over Greenland. The first in November of 2016, where the temperature spiked 36 to 40 degrees above the norm. And the other photograph was from February of 2017, where that same temperature anomaly occurred. These temperature anomalies are causing the Arctic to melt rapidly. As you know, 1 degree temperature difference determines whether there will be ice and snow or water and rain. In January of 2018, it has rained several times in several Alaska Native coastal communities. These temperature increases profoundly impact Arctic sea ice. Arctic sea ice has decreased by 40% since 1979. The three lowest maximum extents of Arctic sea ice, which is annually measured in March, has been recorded in 2015, 2016, and 2017. In 2017, the maximum extent was recorded 5 days earlier than the norm. Since 2007, Arctic sea ice during the summer has also been disappearing. The 10 lowest extents of Arctic sea ice have occurred in the last 11 years. Decreased Arctic sea ice extent and warming temperatures delay the freezing of the Bering and Chukchi seas. Since the 1980s, Arctic seas have remained ice-free approximately 3 weeks longer in the fall. These changes are profoundly affecting the habitability of the places where Alaska Native communities are located. Arctic sea ice forms a natural barrier for coastal communities during fall storm season, when hurricane-strength winds can batter the coast. Without Arctic sea ice fastened to the coast, these communities are now in danger when these storms occur, causing extreme flooding and erosion. This past winter, these storms devastated several coastal communities. As a consequence, several Alaska Native communities are deciding that the best long-term adaptation strategy is the relocation of their entire community. Numerous reports have been written documenting the impacts of climate change and accelerated rates of erosion on Alaska Native communities. These federal and state government reports have determined that there are 31 villages imminently threatened in Alaska, and 3 of them have made the decision to relocate. The remaining communities are in a process trying to determine whether or not they also need to relocate in order to protect community residents. At the Alaska Institute for Justice, we are working with 15 of these 31 Alaska Native communities. It is important to understand what is planned relocation. The most important thing to know about planned relocation is that it must be voluntary, which means that the right to self-determination must be embedded in a planned relocation process. And the reason for this is because we know that government-mandated relocations have uniformly been disastrous for the communities that have been forced to relocate. In Alaska, these relocations, forced by the government, occurred recently during World War II, when the Anungan people were forcibly relocated from the Aleutian Islands in Alaska to Southeast Alaska to theoretically protect them from the Japanese. 10% of that population died as a result of the relocation. And for this reason, the right to self-determination, to determine whether, when, and how to relocate is critical. The second thing to understand about relocation is that it must be a disaster risk reduction strategy, which means that the relocation needs to be planned well before an extreme weather event comes, like a hurricane, and displaces people so that they are in an emergency situation needing food and water. Because in those circumstances, it's really difficult to protect the right to self-determination without interfering with that ability to make a decision about where to go and how to go. And then the final piece is, how can human rights be protected in this process? The right to improve livelihoods, the right to maintain access to traditional foods is critical as we're thinking about the relocation process. There are three governance issues that impact whether or not relocation can occur. In the United States, there is no government agency that has the mandate or funding to relocate a community. And this has meant that for the three communities that have made the decision to relocate, Newtok, Kivalina, and Shishmaref, have not yet been relocated. They are currently living in a humanitarian crisis without the ability to protect from fall storm seasons and no roads connecting these communities. The storms coming in threaten their lives. There's also no institutional framework to determine the point in time when relocation needs to occur. How can a relocation occur prior to the occurrence of an extreme weather event? What are the indicators to make the decision that relocation is the best adaptation strategy? And how can we make sure that communities have access to the information that they need, that they are connected with state and federal government agencies, so that at a multi-level scale, from the tribe to the federal government, each level of government is working together to plan the relocation of the population, with the tribe leading the effort and determining whether, when, and how to relocate. And as I've already said, how will human rights be protected in this process? There are many human rights instruments that currently exist that identify several of the human rights that need to be protected. These include the right to life, the right to self-determination, the right to practice and revitalize cultural traditions, the right to safe drinking water, the right to improve livelihoods, and the right to safe and sanitary housing. And as you can see, there are a number of human rights documents that enshrine these rights. The challenge is that none of the human rights documents that exist, the Universal Declaration on Human Rights, the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, none of these human rights documents specifically talk about the human rights of community relocation. And most critically, only the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples talk about the collective rights of people, the collective rights to practice and revitalize cultural traditions, the collective rights to subsistence, the collective rights to self-determination. These are the human rights that need to be advocated for and enshrined in any relocation process. As I've mentioned, Newtok is one of the communities that's made the decision to relocate. As you can see, storms severely threaten the ability of their community to remain where they are. They have identified a relocation site across the Ninglick River, which is about 9 miles away from their current location. And despite working for almost 20 years to relocate their community, they have still not been able to relocate despite tremendous advocacy by the community residents to Congress, to the White House, and the need to figure out an institutional framework that protects human rights is absolutely critical, because we want to make sure that no other community is faced with this type of a humanitarian crisis. When President Obama was in office, he also recognized that there was no institutional framework to address the issue of climate change related displacement, and that there was an enormous need for the federal government to address this issue and establish an institutional framework to respond to the complex challenges associated with climate related displacement. At the Alaska Institute for Justice, we are designing what we call an adaptive relocation governance framework embedded with human rights protections, where we always focus on protection in place. Communities are trying to determine what needs to happen in order for them to remain where they are. We're also working with them to identify the relocation indicators where they can determine whether or not it's possible to remain in place. And these indicators, when they're identified, can then be used to identify when a relocation process needs to begin. We're working with 15 Alaska Native communities, as I've mentioned, and they are all located along the western coast of Alaska, from Eyak in the south central part of the state to Kivalina in the northwest. None of these communities are road connected, and so when extreme weather events happen, they cannot easily leave their communities, and without that Arctic sea ice, as I've already mentioned, they are in danger when the storms occur. The work that we're doing now is focused on community-based environmental monitoring, because we believe that focusing on community-based environmental monitoring will assist in ensuring that the human right to self-determination is protected. This environmental monitoring is now occurring in 5 of the 15 communities that we are working with, where we installed erosion monitoring devices with the Alaska Coastal Hazards Program last summer. This summer, we're going to 2 additional communities to install erosion and permafrost thaw monitoring devices, because it's understanding at the local level how environmental change is happening and how these changes are impacting community health and well-being. This information will help identify the relocation indicators so that communities can make the decision about whether, how, and when they need to relocate. We're also working to identify the programs that can provide technical assistance and funding. It's important to remember that what happens in the Arctic doesn't stay in the Arctic. As you can see, Greenland's ice sheet was 97% in a melt zone in July of 2012. And the impact of that ice melt obviously impacts sea level rise. It is urgent that we curb our greenhouse gas emissions so that we can stop the melting of Arctic sea ice. These are the questions for you to think about. I hope this information will be helpful for you to protect the human rights of the places where you live and the people who are living there.